As most of you know, I recently finished writing a book about Swami Kriyananda, which starts in 1969 when I met him and ends when he died in 2013, and goes chronologically year by year. The book will be published, I hope, by the end of this year, if not in the spring. As I progressed, the book was very loyal to time. It's something that I didn't necessarily plan in advance, but that's the way it came out. So much so that even Swamiji's words, almost all, are included in the chapter in the year that he spoke, or very near to it. Normally when I talk about Swami Kriyananda, the founder of Ananda, direct disciple of Yogananda, for those of you who aren't familiar with him, he was my direct teacher. I just talk in a complete random relationship to time. The first book that I wrote, Swami Kriyananda, as we have known him, is a collection of stories, and I just put together everything that related, no matter when it happened. So it was an interesting discipline, as it was imposed upon me, as the book revealed itself, to have to be so completely loyal. My experience of Swamiji, as I write in there, was that his consciousness, from the first moment I saw him in November of '69 until the last time I saw him in March of 2013, his consciousness, I always experienced it the same. But because of his own destiny and the responsibilities he had, he expressed himself very differently. As a relatively speaking young man starting a work in America in the '60s, when everything here, especially in this area where he was living, was all so explosive with these new teachings and introducing this kind of spirituality mostly to Americans at that time who had their own creative interpretations. He had many reasons for presenting himself in a certain way, which was primarily as a disciple rather than a teacher in his own right, and to a very large extent is just one of the crowd, perhaps with more enthusiasm and more energy and a little more experience than the rest of us, but completely devoid of any of the accoutrements of spiritual leadership, which were commonly being accepted and embraced by the plethora of other gurus who were coming up during those years, many of whom was appropriate. It was a decision by Swamiji. So what happened over the course of years, especially accelerating after the year 2000, was he gradually, what I would call, removed the veils. So that he was always the same, but he kept his consciousness veiled. People of advanced spiritual realization have the capacity to influence the ideas that even arise in other people's minds. Swami Kriyananda talks about many instances when he was with his guru, Paramhansa Yogananda, with Master, in which he would go in with a certain intention, but in the presence of Master, certain thoughts simply would not arise. For example, Yogananda declared that in a previous incarnation he had been William the Conqueror, which in and of itself was a startling idea. There's a whole beautiful book written about it called 2 Souls, 4 Lives, so I'm not going to go into it in detail. You can get the book at East West or in our shop here. And many of the disciples were saying, well, if you were that historical figure in the past, who was I? And Master answered the question and told lots of the disciples who they were. Well, Swami Kriyananda was very close with Master, and in fact had grown up under the English educational system, so William was a very big figure in his educational life, although a villain rather than a hero. But it would have been perfectly natural to have asked Master, who was I? But he said the thought never crossed his mind. And only much later, by intuition and by research, did he determine that he was in fact Henry I, who was Yogananda, William's actual son, and in fact eventually inherited both kingdoms. And the rule of Henry I in England was 30 years of the most peaceful, prosperous era that England has almost ever known. It would have been natural to ask, but Swami said it never occurred to him, because in the context of everything else that had to play out, it wouldn't have been helpful for him to know. It would have been counterproductive for him to know, so the thought was simply suppressed. So I've seen with the time that I've been with Swamiji and his talking about Master, they create an atmosphere around them which is all to the good for us because it's guiding our thinking in the way we need it to be. In the early years of spirituality in the West, in California and San Francisco, where really much that happens in the world starts in the 60s and the 70s, there were gurus, all kinds of gurus in all kinds of places, some of them legitimate, some of them self-declared. It looked like good work, and so maybe with a little bit of tweaking of my resume, I can get the job. And so people were appearing, and then Americans, having no idea what this is about, were just falling at the feet of anyone who claimed that you ought to, and some of it did not end well. So Swamiji, being heir to a true tradition, understood that true discipleship and true spiritual teaching is not a matter of imposing on someone else an attitude that looks right. It's actually awakening in the heart of each devotee their own intuitive understanding. So among the many ways that Swamiji communicated that with us, which was to never accept the role of teacher. Teacher, yes, but never guru, never spiritual leader in that sense. All devotion was directed toward Master and to the others on the guru, and he was a brother disciple sort of helping us along. And therefore, whatever relationship anybody developed with him had to be not from dogma, not from cultural expectation, but simply from actual true experience. That this is what I myself have discovered, and regardless of what it looks to be on the outside, this is what I know. Because sooner or later, in everybody's spiritual life, no matter what religious tradition you follow, sooner or later something will happen to you that will push you beyond the ideas you hold in your mind. And this is where true spirituality really begins. It's one thing to look around and see that this is how everyone else believes, and so this is how all believe. 100 million people can't be wrong, and they all say that this is true, so this is what all do. And it's not as if such a thing is bad at all. It's better to embrace a spiritual tradition from the outside than not to embrace one at all. I mean, that's really what we're working with. I had a very strange experience once. I unwisely, I believe now, accepted an invitation from the California Atheist Society to appear at some kind of a conference that they were having somewhere down in Santa Clara. This woman just kept calling me, and I kept saying no, and then she kept calling me, and finally I thought, all right, I'll go. So they were having the state chairman of the California Atheist Society, who actually, he looked like they had written to a talent agency and asked to have the state chairman of the California Atheist Society come. I mean, he was classic. He looked like my idea of what Rasputin would look like. I don't know what Rasputin actually looked like, but kind of an evil wizard. He was kind of craggy and all dressed in black, and he actually had his hair dyed black and wore it sort of long. I mean, I would have laughed, except there was nothing funny about it. But he was so into the part. So he comes and he speaks, and almost everyone in the room was part of this atheist society. And then they had representatives from a number of religious traditions. I was representing self-realization, the Eastern tradition. There was an Episcopal priest. I don't know if there was a Catholic. They might have had enough sense not to come. There was an Episcopal, then there was a fundamentalist Baptist person and myself, and I'm not sure if there were any others. I ended up next to the Christian, as they call themselves. I say it that way because they own the word. They try to own the word, and I don't think they own the word. So the Episcopalian was trying really hard to leave space, hold space for everybody's point of view, including the fact that what he was doing was complete delusion, but he was trying really hard. The fundamentalist guy and I just kept leaning into each other like this. It was like, I felt, honestly, like he and I were the only two people in the room who could feel, can't think of any other word except evil, except could just feel how dark the room was. And we were sort of just huddled together like this. And at one point I said to him, you know, in other circumstances, we wouldn't get along with each other. We would be finding fault with each other, but not here. You know, here we recognize this is light against darkness, and you and I are buddies on this. Somehow or another, the evening passed. Nothing else except my alliance with this man actually stayed in my mind. Now, the reason I mention that is because I was talking about, his spiritual approach was quite different than mine. Although, to be fair to him, I sincerely felt, and I think that's why we had such an alliance, that his spirituality was completely internal, that his was a state of realization that he had then attached in his zeal to this particular dogma, but the experience came first and the dogma came after. And that's what I'm talking about here, that sooner or later, if it's only something we've pasted on from the outside, God will keep pushing us to the point. What do you believe and why do you believe it? What do you believe and why do you believe it? And can it stand up against what? Tragic death, disappointment, loss, betrayal, sickness. Make a long list. You can look at your own life, look at your neighbors, or if you were really strong, turn on the national news, but only if you have friends with you and you're really solid. And I don't just mean our country, I just mean, wow, what a circus is happening right now from the point of view of true values. And I can talk a very good philosophical line, and I'm trying to do it today, here, right now. But I, like all of you, I'm vulnerable. My sense of faith in God is not something that is all settled and I know I'm going to heaven by any means. It's something that happens every single day. What do I believe? Why do I believe it? If I believe it, why am I nervous? Why am I anxious? Why am I not loving everyone? Why do I worry about myself? Why do I worry about other people? At the end of my parents' life, they lived in Southern California, and I ended up having to be very involved in their care the last few years. And my mother was physically unwell. Many of you know this. She had Parkinson's for about 15 years. It's interesting. She died in her early 80s, so she was my age when she was going through a lot of that. And my father was healthy and well until the last couple of years. And then something happened. It wasn't really quite a stroke, but something happened, and there was a sudden deterioration in his mental state. He remained fairly cogent to the end, but he shifted radically. What I think happened is it just got to be too much for him. And he just decided he would take a little holiday just before he actually took his astral vacation, like this. But it was, fortunately, circumstances were good, relatively speaking, so it wasn't a horror show, but still, it was no fun. It was no fun watching them struggle in the ways they had to struggle. And for a while, in my rather efficient, I can take care of things way, I was sort of practically commuting back and forth to Los Angeles, and in my efficient, I can take care of things way, was taking care of things. But internally, I was not at peace by any means. And I had to remember at one point, finally, because what happened was in my efficient, I can take care of things way, my parents didn't appreciate it. Here I am to make your lives right. according to what I think would make your lives right. And what do you know? They had their own opinions, despite everything else that was going on. And finally, I had this realization, which is where I'm trying to come to, just all of a sudden, which is every soul has its own destiny. Just every soul has its own destiny. My mother was marvelous to me at one point. I became so anxious. I'm not afraid of dying. I wasn't afraid of them dying. In fact, for my mother especially, it seemed like death might be welcome to let her out of that body, which was increasingly difficult. But she said to me one day, "Every time I cough, you think I'm about to die." She said, "I am not about to die. There's lots of life in me still." And my God, she was telling me the truth. It's like I was always on edge like this. But she was having her own destiny. And, really, I was suffering more than she was, because it was her destiny. She was standing right where she needed to be, exactly at the right place, and she'd attracted to herself exactly what she needed. And to her credit, she was facing into it day by day. Not always with perfect skill, but always as she needed to. And I thought to myself, I try to think that I'm not afraid of whatever karma's coming to me. Then why am I so afraid for everybody else on the planet? Why am I so anxious? And I realized this is not love. I could say, oh, well, I'm worried because she's suffering, because this might happen and that. This is not love. This is fear and self-interest. And I had to just stand back and say, this is fear and self-interest. Why do you think that God is taking care of me and not taking care of anybody else? That God is just waiting for me to fix everyone else's life, and that no one has the power to face their own lessons and learn them and go forward. And if you think about it, all our anxiety about everybody else's suffering, yes, there's an element of compassion, which is, of course, vital. Don't misunderstand this teaching. And it's also true that each of us has to decide, what am I being called to do and how can I do it? But even the right action, if the motivation is fear and lack of faith in God, is not going to bring about the right result. In our building of Ananda, one of the principles that has always been essential is the principle, where there is dharma, there is victory. And dharma means right action, that action which draws us closer to divine consciousness. And what that means is, if we are acting in accordance with the divine interest of ourselves and everyone, then it will always come out victorious. Does that mean it will always come up tidy and neat and according to our plans? No, actually doesn't mean that. But if the consciousness is correct, it will always come out right. So here I am trying to help my parents and trying to, use all the energy and willpower I have to make this happen, but I'm not actually trying to help my parents, or at least 40% is that, but 60% is I'm trying to make myself feel better. And above all, I don't trust God, and I don't respect them. So what are the chances of this coming out right? In this world, not just the present world, but in this world, it's a very, very insecure place. Just in seconds, everything can change, just in seconds, just like that. Accidents, sicknesses, medical diagnosis, financial loss, natural cataclysms. I don't have to make a list. What to speak of icky people who have power and are exercising that power. We have only one point of security, and that point of security is the absolute knowledge that Divine Mother is in charge, and she never lets go of our hand. And even though she leads us through the valley of death and darkness, that hand is always, she is always holding on to us. And we can solve our personal dilemmas in lots of different ways. We're efficient, we're very left brain in this area, we really know how to do things, we can really make things happen, and if God gives you that kind of skill, well then for heaven's sakes use it, why not? But underneath it, we have to know, I'm using my God-given reason, will, and ability but God-given is the point. God is the point. We have this wonderful story in our reading today, really one of the most gorgeous in the Bible, which is this story of this woman who has been hemorrhaging for 12 years. She's been ill for 12 years. No human intervention has saved her. But she has become persuaded that there is this power from the infinite, that it exists, and that it exists in the person of Jesus. Now, think how many elements had to come into play. And this cannot be just because other people told her. Because the way Jesus responded to her tells us about her consciousness. I mean, many people believed that Jesus could help them, and they were all crowding around. That's why after this woman touched him, touched even the hem of her garment, not even his physical body, but just the hem of her garment, he knew that he'd been touched. And think of it as an actual scene. He turns to his disciples and says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples say, "Lord, there's crowds of people, and they've all been coming up against you." No, he said, "Somebody touched me." And they think, what is he talking about? And then he has this magnificent phrase, "I felt power go out from me." Do you hear that way that's said? Power went out from me. Jesus himself, he lived in a physical body. He identified with that body enough to know to move it around. But he was one with the Christ consciousness. His awareness was of the infinite, and that power just went through his body. Now, because I lived with Swami Kriyananda for so many years and observed and watched him, you know, from the egoic point of view, you think, well, a spiritual teacher calculates and decides. You know, he says this one needs that and this one needs that, and I'm going to give this one this certain obstacle and it will create that, and then this will happen. And we have all this idea of all this sort of reasoning and kind of manipulating of circumstances. Swami Kriyananda did none of that, absolutely none of it. He himself aligned himself with the divine and then allowed to happen what had to happen. I mean, and he would be scarcely, let me phrase it differently. He didn't bother to inquire. If this felt like the right action, he would take it. If this felt like the right thing to say, he would take it. He would say it. And then later he would be literally interested to see what the result was. And it just flows through. It doesn't flow through when we have this ego system that's always calculating the different points of view. It does flow through when that ego has been mastered, and as Yogananda said about himself, no one dwells in this temple now but God. So Jesus is moving through the crowd because his heavenly Father, as he thought about it, told him to move through the crowd, and everybody's grabbing at him, but none of them are calling from God the response that this woman had. So Jesus is just literally the intermediary. She grabs the hem of his garment, and the power of her sincere devotion draws it through him. And Jesus becomes aware, someone touched me. All of these people crowded around me, and he, of course, would give them as much as he could. But it was to them who received him. Those were the ones to whom he could give the power. And this is what our job is in this world. This world is a really crazy place. You know, when I was younger, I really didn't know that. I really thought, I would hear Swami say things about the nature of the world, and I would just think that he was a little cynical. You know, I didn't know, I couldn't reject it, but I couldn't accept it either. But year by year, as I match him year by year, he was 22 years older than me, so I was about 22 years behind, or maybe 22,000 years behind. But in any case, year by year, as I have experience, everything he says begins to make sense. However, and this is where I was starting when I was talking about chronologically, at the very end of Swamiji's life, when he had finished all his work, when he no longer had to protect us, from a wrong understanding, he just let the veil down. And he just became a very different person in the last years. Just everything that was on the inside became on the outside, whereas before he had always kept it very much within himself. And this state of almost continuous bliss began to express through him, which made it literally difficult for him to relate to the world. It made him difficult for him to give classes in the way he used to. He could still write, but he just didn't like to be with people as he'd been before. It was very, very different. But he said at the very end of his life, he said, I don't understand. He said, so many people as they grow older grow bitter and cynical, he said. Don't they understand that there's nothing in this world but bliss? Don't they understand that underneath it all, there is nothing but bliss? And then he would just, usually he could only speak for a few minutes because then the feeling of it would overcome him and he would go into a state that was beyond speech. Now, I've been thinking about that a lot recently because how many of us are continuously aware that there's nothing in this world but bliss? And what kind of a life ends in that realization? This is why the masters come into the world, because they want to show us. Swami Kriyananda's life is the one that I was privileged to witness. It was, in a sense, it was a very, very simple life. It was a life that said, Divine Mother, how can I serve? That's really all he ever said. Divine Mother, how can I serve? And Divine Mother, whatever you give me, I accept with gratitude. And he was a warrior for that point of view. If we ever imagine for a minute that such a state of surrender and understanding comes just for the asking, well, try it and you'll see. It's not enough to say, I am saved. God has to also respond. And God responds when we clutch the hem of his garment with sufficient, determined, disciplined, dedicated, moment-by-moment understanding that this is the only reality. And all of the adventures of this world, which are very, very colorful, entertaining and inspiring, Master calls them, sometimes heartbreaking, they're there for one purpose. We think it all is an end in itself. But everybody who passes from this world and then more recently comes back, all of these near-death experiences that people are having, they all come and say, wow, had a wholly different purpose than the purpose I thought. I thought it was about lining up all my little ducks, as they call them, just lining them all up. That had nothing to do with it. How much did I love? How much do I serve? How much do I maintain my awareness that Divine Mother is always with us and she knows what she is doing? Why then am I ever afraid? Every time that anxiety, whatever form it takes, and God is very clever. It'll be about your money or about your relationships or about your health. He'll find just that little point of vulnerability and then he'll drive a truck through it, right, like that. Isn't that so? Just one little tiny attachment, well, that's one too many. One little misunderstanding, that's one too many. And it just keeps cracking us. And it's easy to get annoyed about ourselves or about other people. But every time that comes, we just ask ourselves the simple question, is God in charge? When I was very distressed once about something that was happening to someone I loved and I was literally weeping, this thought came into my head. I go like this because it came in my right ear, went through my brain, and then came out my left ear. And it said, do you think this is happening outside the will of God? And I was actually annoyed at the fact that I had to say, of course it's the will of God, because I did not want it to be the will of God. I had a very strong opinion about it. But I had to say, of course not. Then yes, everyone is suffering. But how can that be bad? The soul has its own destiny and courageously walks into it, which is sometimes walking in front of a bus and getting just absolutely smashed. But we walk in front of the bus because the end of this story is bliss. And the only way we can get to that bliss is by having everything other taken away from us, all of our false ideas. The end of the story is bliss, but we reach it by constant, determined, unrelenting effort. No matter how much God tries to break our determination, that we are more determined still. That Jesus walked through that huge crowd, and one woman touched him, and the power flowed through. Let us be that one. Let us be that one no matter what happens. Visualize in your mind, which I do it many times when things are getting really tough. I visualize Jesus walking through that crowd, and I see myself grabbing the edge of his garment and then just holding on like that. You know, whatever works. It can't be dogma. It has to be truth experienced within. And the great secret of this life is, if we don't let go, then we too will be able to say, why do people become depressed at the end of their life? It's nothing but bliss. We may not be able to say it all the time, but eventually. As Lahiri said, eventually, why not now? Swami said, we'll get it right sooner or later. Why waste a few million years? That's what he said.